It's right opposite where the oncoming traffic would be stopping. The event was well documented with photos by Howard Chang and other staff members. Cars traveling behind the bus, pulling away from the stop sign, were trying to go around the bus. And yet, with all this fiasco going on, and this stop is proposed as the best place to put it. I'd be curious how many times this spot was tested to see if that was an exception or if it would be an ongoing traffic issue with cars trying to get around the bus. Would it not be a likelihood that as our city continues to grow as quickly as it has, that this intersection will become substantially busier as it already has? So will we just throw out operational and safety concerns for all the wrong reasons? The largest contributing factor to the location of the bus stop has been this peculiar desire to put in a monstrous 31-foot by 6.5-foot concrete platform at an expense approaching $10,000. Very few people use this stop, as evidenced by GRT's own records, one or maybe two at a time, once or twice a day. So why the need for such a large platform to accommodate wheelchair access, including a sidewalk to the nearest crosswalk? This is not the case with most, if not all, bus stops around the city. Why so much interest to create this ideal bus stop at a very not ideal location? Regarding wheelchair access, there is absolutely no evidence to suggest it is necessary to have such access at this particular spot. To the contrary, this is a sufficiently affluent neighborhood that wheelchair users generally have their own transportation. Failing that, GRT has a wonderful service, Mobility Plus, that allows any wheelchair user to call and have a special bus come to their specific location and pick them up and take them directly to where they want to go at the same cost as the bus fare. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the Mobility Plus buses there. Not to mention the local taxi companies that now have many wheelchair taxis available. So which wheelchair users are going to be using this bus? And if there were any, why would we try and accommodate those exceptions at a great expense instead of using Mobility Plus? The new route for the bus down West River Road, in both directions, instead of Tate Street, makes the use of this stop even less likely for people coming up from the other west side of Tate Street, as they have even further to walk to get to the bus route. There shouldn't even be a bus traveling north on West River Road. The loop could run in just one direction. The total loop time is only 30 minutes. And then there is the impact on the neighborhood look and feel. West River Road has a very peaceful country-like setting to it with deep setbacks from the road to the houses and landscaping that reaches right out to the road, including many large, beautiful trees. And there's two photos looking up and down each direction on West River Road to show the amount of trees and the landscaping that comes right out to the street. Any sort of concrete platform is out of sync with this street and will cause damage to somebody's trees. Here's an illustration of what it would look like with that big concrete platform in front of the property. Any bus stops should be kept natural in their natural state on this street, as is done around the city. The look of the present temporary stop is simple and natural and inexpensive, such as the one on Middleton Street that also has no sidewalk, platform, or crosswalk. And there's a picture of the stop at 55 Middleton Street. It's been there for years like that in its natural state. And the picture below that is the First Avenue stop by Canadian General Tower. It's a highly used stop, and they just have the sidewalk for its platform. And the bottom picture is the current temporary stop position in a natural landscape. The city and GRT have to listen and make this make sense for the neighborhood. When the proposed new driveway to Tate Street School was made known, there was a backlash from the neighborhood, and the school board negotiated with the residents for a compromise that was effective and agreeable to both sides. Likewise, in the building of roundabouts, reconstruction of sidewalks and streets, etc., homeowners are rightly consulted as to the impact the project will have on their property, and many improvements are added to the projects to accommodate these residents. No one has approached us for any discussions on what would be contemplated at our home to protect our trees. Not just the initial construction, but the ongoing maintenance, including winter salting and snow removal. We have spent in excess of $200,000 in exterior landscaping, and we have lived there for 26 years. You are going to have to show some respect for that. As a minimum, we would expect a 2 to 3 foot tall wall separating our landscape from any platforms, such as a row of armor stone as we have seen used often. And there's a suggested illustration there. Don't get me wrong, we really don't want this. In closing, we suggest the desire for a large permanent platform and sidewalk access to the crosswalk be abandoned, and the bus stop be placed wherever is the most operationally safe and kept in its natural state. Attached, there's letters from other concerned neighbors who were unable to attend, and I have a separate section here. There's 3 letters that could be attached from 3 different neighbors who oppose what's going on. They were unaware that the stop was going there. They were unaware of this big concrete platform that was proposed, and they object to the look it will have on West River Road in their neighborhood. And they also object to the lack of safety with the choice of this particular bus stop. So I have these 3 to hand in as well to attach to my report, and that's all I have to say today.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Holmes. Any questions to Mr. Holmes? Councillor Foxton.
Thank you, and through the chair, I grew up on this street, born and raised, 7 kids in my family. Know it very well. Mobility Plus is not just for wheelchair people. If you have a knee replacement, you're not allowed to drive for a minimum of 6 weeks, or a hip replacement. So you will need to get to rehabilitation, you need to get to the hospital, you need to get to various things. You need a ride, and busing probably. Mobility Plus, you don't just say, I want Mobility Plus and call that morning and it comes. Okay, you have to book it 24 to 48 hours in advance. And then, if all the taxi scripts or the buses are full, you can't get on. So saying why the need, anybody that has a knee replacement, and if you'll excuse me, I know a lot of that area well, and they're not very young people anymore, so hip replacements and knee replacements aren't really out of line. So again, the Mobility Plus issue is is not really valid. Busing, regular busing is valid. We're an aging population, not just in Cambridge, but all through the region. And we're trying to get people to rely more on public transit than on their vehicles. And also, you have to remember, Mobility Plus, it covers the blind or the poor of sight, the deaf. You know, there's a whole host of things that would cover the disabled. Thank you.
Councillor Clark.
May I respond?
Yeah.
So Mobility Plus, if you make application, will take you to the hospital and places like that if you have temporary needs. And anybody in a wheelchair that's not able to use the normal bus system is or can apply to Mobility Plus and will be approved to use that service. We check directly with them. So I understand that sometimes you can't just phone and have it come out immediately, but you can plan ahead. If you're going to the hospital, my experience is a couple of weeks ahead of time for appointments like that. So it should be lots of time to be able to call and make arrangements with Mobility Plus. But aside from that, we don't ever see any wheelchairs along West River Road there or to any of the bus stops. Why this particular bus stop to be so large is to accommodate wheelchairs when none of the other ones do? So why all of a sudden create this ideal wheelchair bus stop in a place that is unsafe, where the bus will be stopping right in the middle of the intersection for a use that's not likely to happen? I would suggest that most people in that neighborhood, if they needed to go to the hospital and couldn't drive, would find someone else to give them a lift.
Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Chair. I think my question is probably for staff.
Okay, well, staff will respond, but first of all, questions to the delegation. Okay, I'm seeing no more, so Mr. Holmes, thank you. If you can take a seat, we'll now introduce the item. It's on page 75
Thank you.
of today's agenda. And Councillor Clark, there's no staff presentation, so we'll go right into questions to staff. Councillor Clark.
So if I'm seeing the pictures correctly, it doesn't appear that there are any sidewalks in the area, and I'm just wondering whether there is a plan for sidewalks in the area. It seems to me that if sidewalks are coming, some of these points are kind of moot.
There are sidewalks on the other side of the street.
I see.
And part of the reason for the length is so that it can connect in with the existing sidewalks. So you can actually cross at the intersection and get to the bus stop.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions to staff on the matter? I did want to ask, Mr. Holmes did ask, there are apparently other bus stops in the area that are either don't have quite this size of pad or may even still, according to some of the pictures, be left in a natural state. What is our policy on the construction in new bus stops? Neil?
Through you, Mr. Chair. We try to make all stops accessible. So right now, we have about 70% of all our bus stops, the 2,500 bus stops throughout this Tri-City area, are deemed accessible. So they have a landing pad or other connections to sidewalks. Every year, we do a capital project to try and roll out more accessible bus stops, including landing pads and other connections to sidewalks and other amenities. With new stops, we do have stops in that area that do not have landing pads. New routes don't always start with landing pads. It depends on construction schedules, reconstruction schedules of certain corridors. So there's a number of factors that come into play about when we put the pads in. In a case like this, we have a new stop in a suitable location for a pad. So we would want to make the stop fully accessible if possible. That would be the intent here. So it's not always that when we put in a new route, every stop gets a pad. It depends on construction schedules and when we can get out there and do that. But we do endeavor to make all stops accessible.
The other question I had is, notwithstanding that Mr. Holmes would prefer not to have the pad there, but what discussions would we normally have with the adjacent landowner in terms of landscaping and tying it in? There are some trees there, there's some considerations. What would we normally do in that regard?
Through you, Mr. Chair. If we have the appropriate right-of-way, we would go ahead and put the landing pad in. Not that we would inform the homeowner. We've had negotiations with homeowners in the past about, modifying or changing stops in certain ways to make them more suitable or more amenable to the adjacent homeowner. So there's discussions we could have there. But at minimum, we want the basic size pad to allow for full access to both of the doors of the vehicle and the connection through to the sidewalk across the street, as Mr. Schmidt already referred to.
So the landing pad is entirely on the city right-of-way?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's correct.
And are you saying it would not impact the adjacent landscaping?
From what we understand from the arborist assessment, Mr. Chair, it would not have an impact on the adjacent trees. The other bus stop locations that we reviewed also had impacts on trees along that corridor, so we didn't want to pick those as suitable locations for a landing pad. This location, we believe, based on the full assessment of the arborist and others involved, would be a suitable location for a landing pad.
Okay, I'm seeing no other questions. There is a recommendation of Chair Redmond.
Thank you, Chair Galloway. Can we just confirm, does the sidewalk on the other side of the road stop at that pad, or why would that be chosen vis-a-vis the sidewalk? Does the sidewalk run the full length of that street?
I believe it does run the full length of the street, and part of all of we looked at 3 different locations along there, and we did look at where can we get pedestrians across. So that was part of each of those pads considerations. How do we get people across the street in a safe way?
And the decision to place it here was because it is at an intersection?
In the report, the decision to place it here was based on a number of different factors, including the impacts on the tree, the sycamore tree, and the fact that we could get this in, one, without impacting the landscaping, and we were able to provide the connection to the sidewalks.
Thank you.
Okay, there's a recommendation to proceed with the bus stop at 185 West River Road. I see no other speakers. So who's going to move it? Councillor Jaworski, seconded by Councillor Armstrong. I'm wondering if we should add to the recommendation or maybe this is what you were going to propose, so that we should add that, notwithstanding there's no obligation, but we should enter into discussions with the Holmeses to make sure that that it's done, as well as it can be in terms of respecting the investment they've made on their property. Is that what you were going to talk about, Councillor Jaworski?
Thank you to the chair. Essentially, I was out for a walk this morning, and you can see the winter maintenance. I think winter maintenance on our bus stops is key, and we're all very fond of having clean bus stops. And the ones that are a concrete pad, done perfectly. The ones that are grass, well, they're done down to the grass, literally. And I would think that the homeowners and the homeowners in this area would find that very disappointing each and every snow clearance time. And so a concrete pad, I think, is one more appropriate for our own passengers, but also appropriate for this. So if it could be tied in as well as possible, perhaps not with armor stone, but to make it as appealing as possible. But I do think the concrete pad is the right solution for a nice, firm, so you can clear it in the winter.
Sure. Okay. All in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Okay, we'll move on to the regular agenda then, the consent agenda. Anything, there are a few items on the consent agenda, a number of items. Anything that anybody wishes to discuss separately? If not, then a motion to accept the consent agenda. Councillor Shantz and Councillor Strickland, all in favor? Sorry, Councillor Shantz.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify something because I've had a number of complaints about the Highway 86, and I had to drive in this morning. And I understand that in 2020 there's going to be some work done on the roundabout. Can you just confirm that for me?
Who's doing that one?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think work is planned in 2020, but I'll circle back to you to confirm.
Okay, thank you. It's very important, as is the bypass. So just get my 2 cents worth in on that one. Thank you.
Bypass? No. Go ahead. Yeah. Oh, I should not have said that. I was just trying to be...
You got me going now. No. The other thing I noticed when I was looking through things is the Scheifele Bridge is, you're starting to do the EA on that one on Northfield Drive, and that's scheduled for 2023. So again, the importance of clearing Highway 86, at least some of the congestion there before you start working on that one.
Okay, all in favor? That's carried. On to the regular agenda then, and the first is the staff presentation on the collision report that we deferred from the last cycle. And Mr. Henderson will make the staff presentation. Good afternoon, Bob.
Thank you. Key sections of the report go over total collisions, pedestrian collisions, cycling collisions, and a key component of the region's collision report is its network screening process, which forms the basis of identifying locations that are in most need of safety improvements. The collision report uses historical performance of collisions over 5 years for each and every location. Other important factors in the report documents, other key contributing factors, not just collisions, but it looks into weather, light, road user actions, road conditions, and traffic control that may contribute to collisions occurring on regional roads. More importantly, the report is used to raise awareness about collisions occurring on regional roads. It's used to allocate limited resources appropriately, including our staff and money and funds spent on countermeasures to improve safety on regional roads. More importantly, to reduce collisions, injuries, and fatalities that occur on regional roads. The collision report really is just a small piece of a larger component of our road safety program. It does form the basis of disseminating information to other various components of our road safety program. The region's road safety program does align with the principles of Vision Zero in the fact that it has components including engineering, education, and enforcement. Engineering initiatives may include countermeasures to improve safety on regional roads, engineering initiatives to change design of regional roads to improve safety. We have various components of education throughout our road safety program. We just finished and wrapped up our 2019 education campaign, the 1 second check. And we have a great working relationship with our Waterloo Regional Police Services to enhance enforcement. And the collision report is really a foundation of identifying locations that may need special attention and increased enforcement. In 2018, the region saw declines in pedestrian collisions, cycling collisions, injury collisions, and fatal collisions. This is confirming the efforts that we're making and strides that we're making to improve safety on regional roads. And these are the facets of road safety that we're really targeting to align with Vision Zero principles. Just want to make a point that despite these reductions in 2018, fluctuations are generally not statistically significant. Fluctuations are normal. They're not necessarily indicative of a trend. And as I mentioned, not statistically significant usually. But what's more important is long-term trends are truly indicative of progress that we're making in road safety. First graph that I want to present to you is the motor vehicle collision history on regional roads. It's a per capita basis per 1,000 population. And the long-term trend really is reaffirming the successes that we're making in road safety. So what this is suggesting is there's, on a per capita basis, there's a reduction in collisions occurring on regional roads over time. We're historically at low levels here in 2018. When comparing our regional roads to roads across the province of Ontario, regional roads are generally performing better than counterparts across Ontario, as demonstrated in this graph. When we're looking at fatal collisions on a 100,000 population per capita, again, like overall collisions, fatal collisions are trending in a positive manner, and we're continuing to make strides to improve that number even further going forward. When we look at cycling collisions, in the early stages of when we were keeping track of statistics, we were seeing an increasing trend. But if you look at the most recent 10-year trend, we seem to reverse the curve in cycling collisions and are trending in a positive direction over the last 10 years. And in 2018 is demonstrating a historical low. When we look at pedestrian collisions, the long-term trend has been an uptrend with pedestrian collisions. However, we believe that over the last 10 years, the efforts that we've been putting into reducing collisions with pedestrians by our countermeasures program and our road safety programs to target pedestrians in particular, we believe that over the last 10 years of our efforts have changed the trajectory of that trend, and we're trending in a positive direction, and we're going to continue to put efforts towards reducing collisions involving pedestrians on regional roads. There's some potential causes that are affecting the uptrend in pedestrian collisions. We're adding traffic signals every year on the regional road network system, including municipal roads as well. And one thing I've been saying lately in the media is that whenever you consolidate motor vehicles and pedestrians in a small space, you increase the potential for more conflicts involving motor vehicles and pedestrians. And based on our statistics, we know that while traffic signals may make it more convenient for pedestrians, they don't necessarily make it safer for pedestrians to travel through. We do know that there are more people walking on regional roads. We're seeing that increase by approximately 5% every year. We believe that trend is coinciding with the numbers that we're seeing in transit ridership increases. As a transit rider, you start and end your trip as a pedestrian, so we see strong ties and correlation there between the two. The region, as mentioned in previous presentations and council reports, we have a number of ongoing engineering initiatives. We have our safety countermeasures program. That's the program where we look at the locations in most need of improvements, dive into the details of why collisions are happening, and target those collisions with specific countermeasures meant to mitigate those types of collisions that we deem abnormal or unusual. We have a transportation capital program where we look at road safety as part of the design of every road reconstruction project that you see on a regional road. There's a lot of work that's done ahead of time where we look at the collision statistics for the limits of a project and identify safety countermeasures to make improvements for those projects. So while you might not see them happening immediately, we can assure you that on every road reconstruction project, there's safety measures being put in as part of those projects. We have systemic safety countermeasure programs, like the pedestrian countdown signal program is a good example, where that systemic program was specifically meant to target pedestrian collisions and reduce the number of collisions happening at traffic signals across the region. We have regional policies like the roundabout policy, which guide and help staff determine where and when roundabouts may be appropriate as a road safety tool to reduce collisions. And as always, staff and people in the region are always looking at new and wonderful ways to help reduce collisions on regional roads through actively researching industry standards. We have ongoing educational initiatives as well. We have a pretty comprehensive road safety public education program. We just finished, or about to finish and wrap up our 2019 education campaign, namely the Extra Sec Check campaign, which was disseminated through a number of mechanisms, including social media and various programs around the region. We continue to educate the public on roundabouts, and we will continue to do so. We have a number of facilities across the region, like the Children's Safety Village, where children can learn about road safety and go home and teach their parents more about road safety as well. And again, like we have initiatives like the Bike Light program, where we disseminated bike lights to school children around schools throughout the region. We have close ties with our Waterloo Regional Police Services and enforcement initiatives. We have the selective enforcement program, where the collision report really helps to identify locations that should be increased in enforcement through the STEP program with Waterloo Regional Police Services. And we have automated red light camera enforcement at various intersections throughout the region. The next steps that we were envisioning the region seeing, we want to implement more proven pedestrian safety countermeasures to help turn that trend in pedestrian collisions and change the trajectory to a decreasing trend in pedestrian collisions. The region will embark on researching new pedestrian safety countermeasures as they come out, and we are also thinking about putting more emphasis on systemic safety improvements to reduce pedestrian collisions. So possible considerations may include an expansion to the leading pedestrian interval program. Right now, that program is targeted at school zone locations throughout the region, and we're thinking that we want to expand that program out to the ION LRT route to emphasize the importance and around the intersections that are situated on the light rail transit corridor. We're thinking about a wider crosswalk program. With the increasing number of pedestrians using our regional roads, we're thinking that there might be some safety improvements by dedicating more space for pedestrians at signalized intersections. And we're also considering a right turn on red prohibition at signals throughout the region to help target pedestrian collisions as well as cycling collisions. You may have heard about automated speed enforcement. We've provided 2 reports to council on this already. The ministry, the province has published its regulations for automated speed enforcement yesterday. The region has been working diligently with a working group to put together those regulations and put together the administrative framework to run the automated speed enforcement program. We're recommending to target school zone locations where speeding may be a problem. So that report will be coming in early 2020. Following this report, as we do every year, we follow it up with a road safety countermeasures program where we'll dive into the details and provide council information about what is actually happening and causing problems at intersections related to motor vehicle collisions, pedestrian collisions, and cycling collisions. And we'll be recommending the countermeasures to council for implementation in 2020. Those reports are tentatively planned for early 2020 in January or February. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
And we have a lot of those. Councillor Banovic.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the report. A number of questions. We'll start with probably the last or the last part of your presentation first, and that's with respect to the automated speed enforcement, because this is something that's very much of interest to the lower tier municipal councils as well. I'm just wondering how you're envisioning the decision-making process between the municipalities and the region around the school zones where this might be put in place. And also, there's likely a desire to, at the municipal level, to see it go beyond school zones and also go into community safety zones, which, I mean, we had them in the past, we got rid of them, and now we're potentially going to be looking at them again at the city. What would the process be to get them included there?
So over the past 2 years, I've been meeting with our local area municipal counterparts, and we've been discussing automated speed enforcement and in particular on how to roll it out. The group is discussing like how to determine sites through a selection criteria that's being developed now. The program, it's interesting. We have to roll it out carefully so that we work together and in a manner that our POA, our court services, can manage effectively. But there's ongoing discussions right now with the municipal counterparts on how to determine which locations will be ideal for selective enforcement.
So I guess I'm just trying to understand where that decision will lie, because many of the schools aren't in fact on regional roads. Some are.
Yeah.
But there's speeding issues in those areas. So will the decision around those lie with the local tier council, with the regional council, with both? Just trying to understand how that process is going to work.
Okay, so we've been discussing a decision-making model with the municipal counterparts. There is a desire from the area municipalities to have the region administer the program for the municipalities as well as the region. And we're looking at rolling out a program that will have a level playing field for all with a similar amount of locations to be selected for sites. Right now we're thinking like proportionately selecting sites evenly across the region on local roads and regional roads as well, and having the region administer that program.
And so right, and administratively, I think that makes sense. Operationally, I think it's really going to be important that municipal concerns are taken into account in that regard. I know that will certainly be a priority for our council in terms of, administratively, it doesn't, it would not make sense to create a second administrative operation to handle these, but I think that can be separated out from the operational decisions around where these go and so on. The second question I have in that regard is, my understanding is we're looking at, there'll be a number of locations as exists with the red light cameras, and then we'll be having a certain number that will rotate through the actual locations. Is that correct?
Yeah, we'll be providing that information through a report.
Mr. Schmidt? Or Mr. Vanderkeer?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'd just like to add to what Mr. Henderson has said. The working group with the area municipality has been functioning great. They've had great discussions and agreement on how they see it happening. Notwithstanding, it's going to be up to the individual councils how they want it to work on their own streets. And definitely, regional council will be deciding what happens on regional roads, and area municipal councils will be deciding what happens on area municipal roads. And that's fundamental to the discussions that have occurred so far, but notwithstanding, it'll be up to the individual councils to have those discussions and decide. But the group is going to be making a recommendation. And there'll be lots more coming in the upcoming report in early 2020.
Okay, because I like I say, this is probably, from a city councilor point of view, traffic concerns are probably one of the single most significant things that they hear about. And I know there's a great deal of interest in being able to move forward proactively on that, and in a timely manner, particularly now that the authority has been given to municipalities to put this in place. And quite frankly, I also think it will help us in terms of some of the challenges that we're all seeing, where we would like to see, particularly in some of the urban areas where we're looking for additional policing resources. I'd much rather have officers deal with some of the other challenges that we're dealing with in our communities and use the automated enforcement. It's a much better use of resources, quite frankly, and I think would probably help out the chief and his team as they deal with those issues. In terms of actually, that's all I'll ask for now. I might come back.
Councillor Shantz?
Thank you. I can echo most of what Councillor Verbanovic has said, especially about traffic concerns being one of the things we hear about the most around our table and from our councillors, and speeding is a big one. But I wanted to get to pedestrian safety, and you sort of glossed over or said it very quickly about looking at school zones. Can you say a little bit more about what you're looking at changing in school zones, or how you're looking at that particular piece?
I mentioned that we have a program that targets leading pedestrian intervals at signalized intersections in school zones. They're meant to enhance the safety for pedestrians.
So you're just, okay, so you're not looking at like raised areas for crossing or any of those kind of initiatives for those areas?
Not specifically. We've always been looking at a number of measures, including raised intersections. Again, there's ups and downs, with no pun intended, with a raised intersection, but there's a time and a place for them, and they're always on our radar screen for something to consider.
Okay. One other question for you. You replaced a crosswalk in Elmira at Arthur and Park with the traffic signals. I think that's working all right. People have talked about whether that was the right intersection, but that's where the crosswalk was. Are you starting to use those more?
Yeah, what essentially happened there was the old piece of equipment called a pedestrian crossover basically blew up. The guts of it fell apart, and there's no more parts for that type of mechanism in Ontario to be replacing and fixing that item with. So there was an EA done for Arthur Street a couple of years ago that recommended the replacement of those old PXOs with new intersection pedestrian signals. And because the equipment malfunctioned prematurely, we opted to replace it with the intersection pedestrian signal in advance of the reconstruction of Arthur Street.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Lawrence.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Mr. Henderson. Bob, you've made my year complete. I've always looked forward to this, the big annual collision report, and you haven't failed me. I do have a couple of questions for you, Bob.
Sure.
On your executive summary, page 65, you talk about the percentage of collisions occurring at intersections. 70% of collisions in the region are at intersections. I'm not so sure if high speeds were involved there. Day with highest number of collisions, Fridays, all Fridays except for a Thursday, which means people are kind of anxious to get home. Months with highest number of collisions, November, December, January, February, winter months. Time of day with the highest number of collisions, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Most common collision type, rear end, all the way across for the last 5 years. And most frequently recorded improper driving action following too close. So just looking at those highlights, it tells me that high speeds are not really the problem. It's that people are following too close, they're distracted, they're not paying attention. And the most common is rear-ending somebody else. So there's a couple of things that I'm wondering what kind of strategy we're going to have for distracted drivers. Because I think that's a big thing. I mean, I hear people honking horns all the time. It's not because someone's in their way, it's because someone's still sitting in the drive lane, not moving when the light changes color, because they're on their phones. So I know the police services have a number of different programs that they're using, but is there some way, somehow, that we can track or tell when people are using their phones? Or, I mean, there must be something in the industry that people like you all across North America are talking about how to deal with this issue. Do you have any suggestions?
Well, the province is coming out with new legislation that has doubled the fine for using a cell phone while driving. It's increased the fine from $500 to $1,000. But that was the focus of our recent campaign, was to take an extra second, give people an extra second of space so that they're not rear-ending each other all over the place. But interestingly enough, I had a person from a local startup company come to me the other day with an interest in detecting people in their cars with cell phones in an effort. Their heart was in the right place to get people using their cell phone less while they're in the car. It's interesting because, like, we all know and we all see people using their cell phone while they're driving in their cars, and hopefully the new legislation with the province has an effect. Hopefully the effect that we did through our education campaign this year has an effect. It's incumbent upon all of us to kind of take those steps not to use our cell phones.
You know, legislation, fines, it's all based the same as with speeding. It's all based on enforcement. And if you don't have enough officers on the road to enforce those laws, I mean, it's really not worth the paper it's written on. I've always been a strong supporter of photo radar, and I'm wondering if I appreciate the school zones, but I'm wondering if we're working on a program where we could roll it out on problem areas along regional roads, at least a pilot project or the way to test it. So that's a question. My second question is, what's the revenue stream on that? Does that money come back to the municipalities, or does it go to the province on those fines?
That information will be in a report to council coming up. Mr. Schmidt may want to.
So the automated speed enforcement cameras and where we're allowed to use them is legislated by the province. So we're giving that authority by the province. So we can't just put them wherever we want. If we wanted the ability to put them anywhere else, the province would have to provide us with that ability. We are doing a report on all of these issues because there are a number with these cameras. And yes, the revenue stream would come back to the region of Waterloo in this case. But we can go through all the details. There's a number of questions today where to be honest, a little bit hesitant on some of these because we feel some we should speak to council and closed on.
Okay.
Because there are some
And I can
implications
appreciate
on some of this, but we are planning a report that's coming forward. We'll do our best to answer the questions today, but
Yeah.
we will have a report coming
Well,
forward.
and my
specifically on that
suggestion
issue.
is, if there's an issue with locations, that we work towards some kind of a pilot project somewhere to see how to test it out, whether it's in conjunction with the province or whatever. But we've talked about this for many, many years. I can remember my neighbor getting it back, I think back in the early 80s when we had photo radar, and people were all upset. But when you see that picture of somebody going fast, they got your license plate number, I think it's pretty impressive. So if you can't get people to slow down by speed limits, then maybe if you hit them in the pocketbook, it might help. So I hope that we can come up with some kind of a pilot project where we can test it and see how it works. That's the solution. Thank you.
Councillor McGarry?
Thank you very much, and through you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for the presentation. And as someone who shepherded the Making Ontario Roads Safer Act through the legislature in 2015, and that included the new legislation on how we were going to combat distracted driving, I'm very disappointed to see that we're continuing to have to increase the fines to see that finally curbed. And in recent conversation with Chief Larkin, he said that if everyone followed the rules, we wouldn't have these collisions. So that's the bottom line, is that road safety is really up to each and every one of us. And interestingly, I just completed a round of town halls throughout my municipality, and the number one issue, bar none, was actually road safety. And how do we get people to recognize that your driving habits can injure or kill somebody else? And in talking about that, Vision Zero is certainly a program that I'm familiar with. But when you look at the pedestrian issues or the pedestrian collisions, I'm wondering, are there some times where it's the pedestrian themselves that are distracted and not following the rules that put themselves at risk of that collision?
Yeah, there's certainly a proportion of collisions. It's the vast majority of collisions are the cause of the driver, but I get the privilege of going through a lot of collisions that I see on regional roads, but there are times when the pedestrian is doing an action that is contributing to the collision. They could be drinking, they could be impaired, or they just could not be paying attention and violating the signals. But the vast majority of collisions that occur involving a pedestrian at a signalized intersection are caused by when vehicles are turning, in particular making a left turn, and a person steps off the curb, unfortunately, in the pathway of a vehicle that's turning left.
And if I may, Mr. Chair, one of the things that you talked about was, again, the intersections. And I know that there's been a number of different community groups in Cambridge that have come forward requesting traffic calming measures. And I know in the Highway Traffic Act it says that, or in our regional road rules, that a four-way stop sign or adding a stop sign is not really supposed to be there for a traffic calming measure, and yet these issues continue to come before our council. Can you identify why that is?
Why
Stop signs shouldn't be used as a traffic calming measure?
I think that basis comes from a long-standing guideline that's been in the industry for a while. It may be time to revisit that standard. I've been talking to my staff about reprioritizing the balance between efficiency and road safety. And I think it's time that that balance be revisited and in favor of prioritizing safety over efficiency. So that old school guideline with always stops was based on, was leaning towards the efficiency of the road network line of thinking. And what I'm suggesting and what you're suggesting is rethinking and revisiting that.
So if I may, a follow-up question on that then, could additional stop signs then actually increase the risk to pedestrian safety? And again, on an intersection, comment please on roundabouts in front of high schools or schools, again, as an intersection. Does that increase the risk, in your opinion, to pedestrians?
Okay, so starting with the always stop. An always stop, just like a roundabout, just like a traffic signal, has a time and a place, and you need to look at and consider the various factors that may contribute to collisions, including the volume of traffic, the surrounding geography and topography. So I can't say with just with a carte blanche swath that it may be appropriate everywhere. I think you have to look at the details of each and every specific location on a case-by-case scenario to determine what is the best traffic control for enhancing pedestrian safety. But in my opinion, always stops locations generally behave very well in terms of protecting pedestrians, more so than a traffic signal, whatever. With respect to roundabouts, your second question, all the research that I've undertaken over the last 10 years and all the data that I look at regional roundabouts continues to re-emphasize and reconfirm that a roundabout is generally a safer environment compared to a traffic signal for pedestrians.
Great, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Kiefer?
Thank you, Chair Galloway. Bob, thanks for the collision report. My question has to do with safety and following up on roundabout safety for pedestrians. I'm still continuing to get calls from pedestrians that are, in jeopardy of their safety. And I know that the region is doing ongoing training for drivers and pedestrians. However, at one point in time, we talked about perhaps looking at implementing maybe flashing signs or something at the crosswalk areas, or even relocating some of the crosswalk areas further back. Is there any further information on that you can share with us, or?
Yeah, to start with the location of a crosswalk, the second part of your question, for some reason I'm working backwards. The location in which crosswalks are designed and built for now places pedestrians within their general desire longs to walk along a roadway. To displace them 100 meters or 200 meters back from a roundabout takes them out of their general desire lines. And it also places them in a location where speeds are exponentially higher, because as you leave a roundabout, you're accelerating, and as you're approaching a roundabout from further back, you're at a higher speed. So it's a more vulnerable point in time for a pedestrian to be. And because the desire line is closer to the roundabout, drivers will be expecting pedestrians to be walking where they're designated to be walking, but they don't want to walk there. So it's a competing task there to make everybody happy. And so again, we keep looking at the statistics on pedestrian safety at roundabouts, and it keeps coming back to prove that they are much better environment for a pedestrian to be crossing through when compared to a traffic signal. The idea of flashing lights at roundabouts keeps on resurfacing, keeping in mind that without the lights, there's still a safer environment than a traffic signal is. When you think about the flashing beacon, in my opinion, it's not something that you can do at one location or one roundabout or one approach to a roundabout. It's either it's got to be all or none. But thinking about a flashing light, when you think about it, pedestrians have a hard enough time using a push button at a traffic signal, and generally don't want to push it and walk across. So if you think about that philosophy, and it's been tested in Quebec, we've working with consultants who have tested this in Quebec, they've found that pedestrians maybe half the time press the button and trigger the light, and half the time they don't and they're crossing, and it creates this very, I'll call it, strange environment where nobody knows what anybody's going to do. When you think about it now, the onus is on the driver to see a pedestrian. We make the sight lines very visible, and we continue to monitor driver behavior at roundabouts, and they are yielding for pedestrians without the use of flashing lights. And we want to create a consistent environment for everybody so that the expectation is understood by everybody.
Do you happen to know of any, not in, let's say in Canada or outside the country, that is using flashing lights at roundabouts?
Not in Ontario. I'm not aware of anybody. I know in the States they've been using what has been termed as a hawk device, and we've presented that to council before. It's a device that cannot be used in Canada. I still wouldn't recommend the use in the United States, but they've chosen to do it in some jurisdictions.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Councillor Armstrong?
Yeah, basically more of a comment. I think the most important part of the program here is education. And I think part of the problem, and I've been trying to preach this for years and years, that the people who are teaching our people to drive need more education. Because I've seen far too many vehicles with driver education signs on the top that are making mistakes, common mistakes when driving, and there's only one person in the car. So that tells me that person is supposed to be teaching our kids how to drive. The other part of it too is more emphasis in the schools to teach the kids, who in turn end up teaching their parents, that as pedestrians, when you're approaching and wanting to cross, that you stop and look the drivers in the eye to make sure that they see you before you step out. And I think that's part of it is what needs to be done, is that we have to start with the kids, and then it'll work its way up into the parents, because the parents have a tendency to sometimes learn from their kids. The other thing about stop signs, when you throw up a stop sign, I hear that all the time out in the country. You have a couple of accidents at an intersection and say, well, there should be 4 stops. It should be a 4-way stop. And my vision of that is just you're putting up extra signs to be ignored. Because people have a tendency today to ignore, and that's part of the reason that the collisions occur, that people are ignoring the stop signs and just rolling through, and they don't have the education to know how to approach, especially in the rural areas when roads don't always align evenly, perpendicular and everything. So I think that's the biggest thing. And I think the biggest thing that we need to do is the education, to get people to learn how to go. I mean, that's all part of the preaching of defensive driving, and we also need to do defensive walking when we're pedestrians. So, I mean, when I was in the military, in order to get a license to operate a military vehicle, you had to take a defensive driving course. And some of the films that we saw were pretty graphic and pretty serious, because one of the ones I remember, and this is from the 70s, that it was called Mechanized Death, and it was pretty horrendous, and it really wakes people up to realize this is the kind of stuff that happened, because what it was, well, Ohio State troopers carried around cameras with them, and when they approached an accident, they filmed it, and there was nothing cut. So you got to see exactly what the results of somebody's mistake was, and it was pretty horrific. And I think maybe that if people, I don't know if we have to go that far, but I think there needs to be more education, people to understand, because I don't think people today completely understand the consequences of their stupidity. Thank you.
Councillor Jowett?
Thank you, through the chair. So when you're drilling in the report on page 65, and you mentioned the number of fatal collisions, Bob, were there any findings, anything that was a tell there that would help us with loss of life in accidents?
Yeah. In many cases, the majority of cases, well, I shouldn't say the majority, but in many cases, fatal collisions, there's contributing factors that usually come out that you see.
Such as?
Such as impaired driving, such as careless driving. I talk with the police on an ongoing basis. We get the details when fatal collisions occur. So we're seeing impairment, we're seeing speeding. There's cases where none of that's involved and it's just a freak accident. Like I've seen tractors pulling into driveways, rolling over in the ditch by misjudging the driveway where it was. I've seen collisions where motorcycles are doing 200 kilometers an hour and running into the side of a horse. So not to get into the details, but yeah, there's usually circumstances that contribute to the causes of fatal accidents. And very few, if any, that I see are related to the road environment.
Okay, I appreciate that. The other question I was going to ask, on page 53, you've got a fairly detailed stats there for collisions, and it looks like in 2002 there was a fairly significant increase. And I know this is going way back, so I don't know if you'll remember, but do you know what that could have been? Was it? I know things seem to be happening. I saw the same trends that Jeff described at rear ends at 5 o'clock on Thursdays, mostly Fridays. Mm-hmm. So when we look at the information on page 53 and we see such an increase per 100,000 population, do you have any memory of what that might have been back then?
I think there was a number of causes. I'll touch on a few that I can think of off the top of my head. I know the overall reporting system with collisions so I'm talking motor vehicle collisions overall on that basis. The reporting was different. You had to report a collision if it was over $1,000. Then it was increased around that time to $2,000, so that might have contributed to a drop in overall collisions. When I look at the fatal collisions compared to overall motor vehicle collisions, you sort of see the same spike as well. And what I think contributes to a higher number of fatal collisions in the past was seatbelt usage and things like that. Right. Car manufacturers have gotten better over time as well. There's a number of factors that contribute to all of this, why these trends are happening. I wish I could say it was just the work that our staff were doing, but that is a contributing part of it, but there are a number of other factors as well.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Bob.
Councillor Urbanovic.
Thank you very much. The other issue that I just wanted to touch on, and it has to do with this overall safety components that you've spoken of. And I think we've talked about this before, and going back in our minutes, I think it was in 2016, we sort of formally last talked about Vision Zero. I know that we didn't adopt sort of Vision Zero branding in the region and created our own Safe Roads Waterloo Region brand. But I also know that some of our cities are currently looking at this issue. I know we are, and whether we want to adopt and become part of Vision Zero, because it is then part of a more global initiative that's looking at this issue and that can take advantage of the sort of global messaging marketing that goes around with it, not just in our city but in other cities. I mean, I know when we were driving in California, you saw Vision Zero in places. I know we see it regularly in Toronto and places like that here. I'm wondering if there's an opportunity for us to revisit it at the region as well, and see if in fact we take a coordinated approach around this.
Interestingly enough, I spoke to our municipal counterparts about this and reemphasized that all the work that the region is doing is perfectly aligned with all the Vision Zero objectives. Everything that we're doing, our road safety program aligns with it very well. We're targeting all the specific areas. We're working with the regional police. We're doing education. We're working with public health. All those objectives align with Vision Zero.
Sure, you even use the words on the webpage.
Yeah, but we've talked with our municipal counterparts about aligning forces to have I'll call it a globalized region program, road safety program, to have a program with the municipal counterparts that we all work together for the same objective.
Okay, thank you.
Chair Redmond.
Thank you, Bob. I'm trying to find it in your report. I know it was on your slides, and Mr. Schmidt and I have talked about this from time to time, and that's a prohibition of right-hand turns on red. How realistic is that? I think drivers would react pretty negatively to, and it's not something the region could ever do. Would this have to be done province-wide?
To have a globalized right turn on red prohibition would require the ability to do it through the Highway Traffic Act, because right now we can't necessarily just sign on the entrance to the region saying you can't turn right on red anymore, because it's a provincial rule of the road. Like in Montreal or Quebec, you cannot turn right on red is a provincial rule. We've been thinking about it, maybe eliminating it to core areas of the cities through signing. It would take a lot of signing to do that. We would have to look at the effects overall. We've been talking with our staff and thinking about seeing what the effect would actually be if we were to put some type of prohibition in like that within the cities or the region for that matter. But yeah.
So I'm hearing you saying that it's site-specific and it could never sort of be pan-regional without having provincial changes done to the legislation. Are there warrants now that make the decision of when we prohibit right on red?
There's guidelines. Generally, you prohibit a right turn on red if there's poor sight lines to the left. If so, picture yourself making a right turn. If you can't see very well to the left, that's a good time and place to put in a right turn on red prohibition to prevent collisions. But there's no mathematical formula to determine when you should put it in. We've prohibited right turns on reds where we've had cycling collisions and had positive results because of that. It's more of a site-by-site, case-by-case basis when you make that decision.
Thank you.
Councillor Foxton.
Thank you. I think I have the solution. We live the Tom Galloway way or the regional way. We bike, we walk, or we take the bus.
I drove today. I drove today.
You took away my moment.
Sorry, Sue. Okay, I have no more questions except my own. So the first question, Bob, is this report is only for regional roads, correct?
Correct.
Do the stats ever get combined with all the local roads as well in terms of collisions and so on?
I know the police have done that in the past. I don't know if they do it on a regular basis, but I know they've compiled all the information together and reported on that. But collectively, from a transportation perspective, we have not done that with the area municipalities.
Because it'd be interesting, and I'm not asking you to do any more work, but to see if the trends are the same on local roads versus regional roads. The regional roads certainly handle more volume. In some cases are higher speed roads. Rural roads, there's some characteristics that are considerably different than local roads, and whether or not the trends are different. The cycling numbers on regional roads that you, or the collisions on regional roads, you're showing a trend downwards. Does that correspond to usage at all, or is there lower levels of usage? I mean, in most cases, regional roads are not, in some cases, are not cycling routes. More and more they are, where we're starting to provide facilities. But typically, the average cyclist won't go on a regional road if there's no cycling facility. And there are some other alternatives that have presented themselves in terms of community trails and other facilities on local roads. So is there any explanation in terms of the cycling numbers trending downwards?
Yeah, I think they're strongly correlated with the infrastructure that we're putting in. So you see that the apex peaked around 2000, and when collision trends were trending upwards and started coming down around that time. And I do believe that's associated with infrastructure like cycling lanes and multi-use trails. We've been putting more and more in over time. It's not exactly a proven scientific explanation, but I do think there's a strong correlation there.
Okay. The no right on red, I'm curious about that. So are you saying that we could impose a no right on red in certain downtown corridors, or are we going up against provincial regulation in that regard, or would we have the right to do so?
If we were to
because
do it,
right on red is the biggest risk to cyclists and pedestrians. Some people would say that.
I would say there's certainly a risk to pedestrians with it. The largest risk to a pedestrian is when a motorist is turning left, but there's also a risk when a motorist is turning right on a red as well. With cyclists, it's when motorists are turning right on green and a cyclist is coming through. We call that a right turn hook collision. But the mechanism in which if we were to consider banning right turns on red in a downtown core would have to be through signing on each approach to a signalized intersection.
But we would have the jurisdiction to do so.
Yep, I could, if you told me right now to ban right turn on red at Victoria and King, we could do it through a council report.
I assume that those were done under guidelines that made it acceptable, but that we could do something carte blanche on King Street, as an example, or on Weber Street or whatever, and just say no right on reds at any of those intersections. Surprised, but pleasantly surprised, I guess. Mr. Vanderkeer, did you want to jump in?
To you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think Bob's already mentioned that it would have to be done individually at each intersection. But there's other things we can look at as well. At some intersections, there may be an opportunity at looking at fully separating the different modes. Of course, it will have an impact on overall capacity, but you could create a situation at one or another location where, you know, the cyclists moved in one movement and then vehicles moved in a different phase. Of course, you'd need separate signals for cyclists and pedestrians versus vehicles. It's definitely possible. They are doing it more and more in cities like Vancouver, but it does have an effect on the overall capacity. So consideration in maybe an urban core area where those pedestrian and cyclist movements have a higher priority might be a place to look at that. So that's something that we might try and start looking at as well moving forward.
Okay, Councillor McGarry.
I just really had a comment about the right-hand turn, and there's emerging technology that could alert drivers to the fact that there's an approaching cyclist, even in a bike lane. And I saw it when I had a recent tour of the L6 test site of the autonomous vehicles in Ottawa, and it was like a road cone with a tall post on it, and it had a flashing yellow light that was triggered well ahead of the intersection by a cyclist speeding up. And so it would alert the driver. It was set at the intersection where a driver could see it before they turned right. So it could potentially be a really useful tool in municipalities, even with separated cycling lanes, in order to alert the driver that they've passed the cyclist a while ago, but by the time they turn right, that cyclist is caught up and then ends up, striking the vehicle as they turn right. But that emergent technology, I think, are some of the solutions we may be able to look forward to on sort of protecting our cyclists and our pedestrians on our roads. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob. That's the end of the questions, and we'll look forward to some of those ancillary reports that are coming forward on some of these initiatives that are of great interest. The next item is the Ottawa Street Improvements, Fischer-Hallman to Alpine. Are there any questions in regards to this particular project? I have one. So the proposed roundabout at Ottawa Westmount does have an extensive amount of pedestrian traffic. And because of the Chandler neighborhood, highly pedestrian neighborhood, commercial enterprises on one major commercial enterprise on one particular leg of this. So are we doing anything different in the design of this roundabout? I know there's some pedestrian refuges that have been spotted around the project area at different intersections, but at the roundabout itself, are we doing anything different in terms of pedestrian access across this particular roundabout?
So, through you, Mr. Chair, my understanding is no, it'll be a typical roundabout design with the pedestrian facilities as described and drivers being required to yield to pedestrians. I'm looking across the room. Our project manager is here in case he'd like to add anything or correct that, but if I'm accurate, then I'll leave it at that.
Okay, John.
I think we have some, great, we've got some graphics. So, yeah, one of the things that we've looked at from day one at this was the fact there is that high amount of pedestrians crossing at Chandler. They're crossing roughly 100 meters east of the intersection at a desire line. So that's actually a location where we're planning. I know people wanted to hear me more. That's actually a location where, there we go. That's actually a location where we are planning one of the pedestrian refuges. So if we could go very quickly to slide 24, please. Okay, so while we're queuing up slide 24, so staff has actually gone out for some fairly informal counts on a few occasions just to see what sort of traffic there is, and we've gone out in peak and non-peak periods. The montage we've got here shows one example from about a week ago. And there's the desire line right there, so that's where the walkway comes out from Chandler, and people walk directly to the Tim Hortons, which is in the bottom of the frame. You see, they also go to Freshco, they also go to Dollarama. So we see people walking across, and we see them coming back with a coffee or Dollarama bag or a Freshco bag. We've seen people cross who are well under 10. We've seen senior citizens with walkers. We've seen parents pushing strollers. So they're not going to the intersection. They're not going out of their way to get to the intersection. So just as an example, in a half-hour period, so the count is in the bottom right, so we have 2, and 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10. They're joined. The 3 of them run across together, another and another, all within the space of half an hour. That's 14. We've counted 20 in half an hour in an off-peak. So our guess is that during the school peaks, which we tried to catch one day, but it was a PD day, and we still caught a number, that the school peaks are probably in the range of 60. So if the cycle is running once every 2 minutes, we are seeing 1 to 2 pedestrians crossing at an unofficial crossing 100 meters east of the roundabout. So the idea here is to put a pedestrian refuge at this location, in addition to the typical pedestrian facilities at the roundabout. So it doesn't show very, nope, it's because I just have to hit the button a couple of times. So there's a couple of desire lines between housing and commercial, and so the project incorporates, in addition to the crossings at the roundabout, which are in line with the desire lines of people who are simply walking on Westmount or Ottawa, we're also providing these pedestrian refuges at the locations where these existing desire lines are. So hopefully that answers that question.
Okay, thank you, John. Elizabeth, or Councillor Clark, rather?
Thanks, Tom, or Chair. Actually, I'm passing on a question that I think councillors received from a constituent who emailed about this project, but specifically she asked about the plan to erect bus shelters in the context of this project. Do we have a timeline for that?
John?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we are putting in bus paths in conjunction with GRT. I don't have their bus shelters scheduled offhand, but we can provide that to council.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. Yeah, we're working with GRT to put in the bus pads that will house the shelters and to add the electrics to allow that to happen as well. I'm not exactly sure of their schedule, but we can get that information and pass it along.
Do we automatically put bus shelters at all iExpress stops?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's correct. At all the iExpress stops, we do plan for real-time information signs, bus pads, shelters, as was pointed out by the project manager.
And Ottawa Street is an iExpress route?
That's correct.
But not necessarily all stops?
That is also correct.
This is the iExpress stop?
The iExpress stops would have the associated amenities with an iExpress service, yes.
Okay. No other questions, so there is a recommendation to proceed with this particular design for construction, starting in whatever, 2020, I guess it is. Councillor Harris, Councillor Foxton, all in favor? That's carried. The next item is the residential water softener program. There's a recommendation there associated with the report on a pilot rebate program relative to water softeners. Any questions in that regard? Seeing none, a recommendation. Councillor Armstrong, Councillor Jowett, all in favor? That's carried. A brownfield financial incentive TIG grant for 70 King Street North in Waterloo. I believe that's the old post office property. The second one is Southworks. The first one is Waterloo. Any questions on that? Councillor Jaworski moves it, seconded by Councillor Erb. All in favor? The next item is the TIG grant for 64 Grand Avenue South. I believe that's Southworks. Any questions in that regard? Moved by Councillor. Do you have a question, Councillor Strickland? No. Okay. Are we in a hurry or what? Oh, okay. Councillor Kiefer, Councillor McGarry. All in favor? That's carried. Any other business? Motion to go into closed session. Councillor Blackston, Councillor Shantz, all in favor? Carried. Thank you.